The barking started the moment deputies stepped through the open door. Two small dogs ran in frantic circles around the living room of the McStay home, their bowls empty, their energy nervous and confused. The house felt suspended in time. A carton of eggs sat on the counter. Fresh paint cans were stacked near the fireplace. The television was off. There was no sign of a struggle, yet something felt wrong in a way that settled instantly into the gut. Joseph and Summer McStay should have been home with their two young sons, Gianni and Joseph Jr., but the house stood silent except for the dogs. San Diego County Sheriff's deputies checked each room, calling out names that never answered. The master bedroom still held the couple's belongings. The children's toys sat on the floor where they had last been played with. There were no missing mattresses, no broken furniture, no signs that four people had packed in a hurry. It looked like the family had stepped outside for a moment and never returned. Relatives had grown worried when calls went unanswered. When Joseph's business partner reported he had not heard from him in days, deputies finally entered the home and felt the strange stillness that comes when life has been interrupted mid-sentence. The only thing actually missing was the family's SUV. Investigators found it 2 days later near the Mexican border in San Isidro. It was parked close to a lot where many people left their vehicles before walking into Tijuana. Surveillance footage showed a family of 4 crossing the border on foot around the same time the SUV was abandoned. The figures were blurry, impossible to identify, but the idea took hold quickly. Maybe the McStays had left the country voluntarily. Detectives wanted to believe it. A voluntary departure meant no crime, no tragedy, no children harmed. But the theory collapsed under weight of the details. Joseph had been working to grow his business, and his accounts showed no preparation for a sudden move. Summer was protective of her children and rarely traveled. Neither had passports for the boys. Friends and family insisted they would never disappear without telling someone. Still, with no sign of forced entry and no evidence of violence inside the home, the case stalled. Months passed without progress. The McStays' home was searched again and again, each time yielding nothing. Detectives combed through financial records, medical histories, and personal messages. Volunteers joined searches across Southern California. Psychics, tipsters, and rumor spreaders called constantly, each with a new direction, a new theory. None led anywhere. The case drifted toward the cold end of the file cabinet, too recent to give up on, but too empty to solve. For years, the family remained missing. The SUV, the border footage, the untouched home. Every piece of evidence could be interpreted in more than one way, and none proved anything. Detectives followed hundreds of leads that ended exactly where they began. The McStays' relatives lived in a suspended kind of grief, torn between hope and dread. Then in November 2013, more than 3 years after the family vanished, an off-road motorcyclist stopped in a remote stretch of the Mojave Desert near Victorville. He noticed something unusual in the dirt, a bone that looked human. Deputies were called, and digging uncovered 2 shallow graves. Inside were the remains of 2 adults and 2 small children. The burials were crude, hurried, and heartbreaking. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared. Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. had been found. The horror was not only in the discovery, but in the condition of the remains. The adults had been beaten with a sledgehammer, a weapon found buried with them. The children had suffered fatal blunt force injuries as well. The image of that discovery settled over the investigation like a weight. This had not been a disappearance. It had been a quadruple homicide carried out far from the family's home, the bodies discarded in the desert, as if someone hoped they would never be found. Detectives rebuilt the case from the beginning. They examined every relationship, every business deal, every conflict. One name surfaced quickly: Charles Merritt, Joseph's business associate. He had worked with Joseph on custom water features and was one of the last people to see him. Bank records showed Merritt had written checks from Joseph's account to himself in the days after the disappearance, forging Joseph's signature. When questioned, Merritt's explanations shifted, grew vague, and contradicted earlier statements. Cell phone records placed Merritt near the gravesite on the day investigators believed the family was killed. Forensic analysis tied his truck to tire tracks found near the burial location. The weapon recovered in the grave matched tools he commonly used. Piece by piece, prosecutors built a timeline that pointed to Merritt as the killer. In the years between the disappearance and the discovery, the investigation had shifted through phases that reflected the uncertainty of the evidence. Detectives traveled to Mexico to confirm whether the blurred figures in the border video could have been the McStays. None of the restaurants, hotels, or tourist spots showed any sign the family had passed through. The footage became less a clue and more a distraction, a thread that had led nowhere. When the desert graves were finally uncovered, that theory locked into place. The positioning of the graves suggested the killer had acted quickly, choosing a remote location known mostly to locals or people who frequently traveled through the high desert. The presence of the sledgehammer, a heavy personal tool, introduced a level of violence that investigators struggled to reconcile with any motive beyond rage or self-preservation. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom remained heavy and quiet. The McStay relatives listened as each count was confirmed, their years of uncertainty finally narrowing into a single, irreversible truth. Outside, reporters recounted the long trajectory of the case: a missing family, a haunting mystery, a discovery in the desert, and a conviction that answered the question of what had happened, but could never explain why it had been allowed to happen at all. Merritt was arrested in 2014. The case moved slowly through the courts, weighed down by thousands of pages of evidence and the brutality of what had been done. In 2019, after a lengthy trial, a jury found Charles Merritt guilty of murdering the McStay family. He was sentenced to death. The verdict offered justice, but not healing. The case left behind a haunting image: a family of four, full of ordinary plans and routines, erased without warning, and left in the desert for years before the truth surfaced. The McStays had not walked into Mexico. They had never left California. They had met violence from someone they knew. The story of their disappearance began with an empty house and 2 frightened dogs. It ended with a courtroom verdict that confirmed what investigators had feared from the beginning: that the family had been killed within days of vanishing, and the desert had kept the secret until it could not anymore. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.